The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence that morning, the kind of silence that made even the smallest sound echo through the hall. Reporters shuffled in their seats, the attorneys arranged their papers, and the families of both the victim and the accused sat nervously, waiting for the trial to begin. All eyes turned when the wooden doors opened and Judge Martin entered the room. He was known as a fair but strict judge, a man who always followed the law without letting his emotions interfere. People respected him for his wisdom and discipline. To many, he was more than just a judge, he was the symbol of justice in their city. But none of them knew what was about to happen that day. Judge Martin sat down, adjusted his glasses, and nodded to the bailiff to begin. The bailiff's voice rang out as he called the case. Then the defendant was escorted into the room. For most of the people watching, this was just another accused criminal, someone facing serious charges. But for Judge Martin, the moment his eyes landed on the man standing in handcuffs, time seemed to stop. His heart skipped a beat. His hand, which usually rested calmly on the bench, suddenly tightened its grip. He could not believe what he was seeing. The man on trial was not a stranger. He was Daniel, his childhood best friend. A wave of memories hit Martin instantly. In his mind, he no longer saw the tired, middle-aged man in an orange prison jumpsuit. Instead, he saw a boy with messy brown hair, running beside him on summer afternoons. He saw two kids sitting under a tree, sharing sandwiches after school, laughing about silly jokes only they understood. He remembered how Daniel had defended him once when other boys tried to bully him, and how they had sworn as children that they would always look out for each other. That promise had faded as life carried them in different directions, but the bond they had once shared was real, and it was deep. Now here they were, sitting in the same room but on opposite sides of justice. One of them was the judge with power over the law, and the other was a man accused of a crime that could change the rest of his life. Martin tried to compose himself. His duty was clear, he had to remain impartial. But inside, he was shaken in a way he had never experienced in his career. No training, no years of practice, could have prepared him for this moment. The courtroom continued as usual, unaware of the storm inside the judge's mind. The lawyers began to introduce themselves, and the clerk read the charges. Daniel stood there, his face tired, his eyes lowered. He seemed older than his years, worn down by struggles no one in the room could yet see. For a second, Daniel lifted his head and looked toward the judge's bench. Their eyes met. Recognition flashed across his face, and for just a heartbeat, Daniel's lips parted as though he wanted to say something. But then he quickly lowered his gaze again, keeping silent as the weight of the trial pressed on. Judge Martin's mind drifted back to the last time he had seen Daniel. It was after high school graduation. Martin had been accepted into college with a scholarship, his parents cheering proudly for him. Daniel, on the other hand, hadn't been sure what to do next. His family had been struggling with money, and he had talked about taking odd jobs to support them. That was the day they had promised to keep in touch, but months turned into years, and their lives drifted apart. Martin buried himself in books and law studies, climbing the path to success. Daniel disappeared into the background, a name Martin sometimes remembered but never searched for. Until now. The judge felt an ache in his chest. How could fate have arranged such a cruel reunion? He wanted to ask Daniel what had happened all these years, how he had ended up here. But he couldn't. Not here, not now. His role was to listen to evidence, to guide the trial fairly, and to uphold justice for everyone involved. He knew the courtroom was no place for personal history, yet it was impossible to erase the emotions flooding through him. The attorneys continued to speak, but Judge Martin's thoughts wandered. He remembered the time when he and Daniel built a treehouse together with scraps of wood they found in the neighborhood. He remembered sneaking out at night with flashlights to tell stories, promising they would always chase their dreams together. But dreams had led Martin to a polished career and respect, while Daniel's path had led him here, standing accused of something that could take away his freedom. It was like watching two parallel lives, once side by side, now separated by walls of law and circumstance. The audience inside the courtroom noticed something unusual. They could see that Judge Martin's face looked more serious than usual, his eyes softer, almost troubled. They whispered to each other quietly, wondering if the judge was ill or distracted. None of them guessed the truth that the man in front of the bench was more than just another defendant. To Martin, he was a piece of his past. The trial moved forward. Witnesses would be called later, but for now, the charges were laid out. Daniel was accused of being involved in a robbery gone wrong, a crime that carried serious consequences. The lawyer explained how Daniel was at the scene, and evidence suggested his participation. People in the audience shook their heads, some glaring at Daniel as if he were already guilty. But Martin knew better than to judge quickly. He also knew Daniel, the boy he once knew, was not a heartless criminal. Something in him resisted the idea that Daniel could have truly become what the papers described. Yet Martin also understood that people change. Hardship can push even good people to desperate choices. As the first session of the trial ended, Martin called for a short recess. He stood up and walked back into his chambers, his steps heavier than usual. Alone in his office, he sat down and pressed his hands against his face. The image of Daniel standing in handcuffs would not leave his mind. He asked himself if he could truly remain neutral. Could he put aside his personal memories and deliver justice as the law demanded? Or would the ghost of friendship always whisper in his ear? The weight of responsibility pressed on him. As a judge, every decision he made shaped lives. But this time, it wasn't just about a stranger, it was about someone who once felt like family. Martin stared at the stack of files on his desk, but all he saw was a little boy smiling at him, asking him to play one more game of catch in the fading sunlight of their childhood. When he returned to the courtroom, his face was composed again. No one would know what he was feeling. He sat down, tapped the gavel lightly, and signaled for the next part of the trial to continue. But deep inside, Judge Martin knew this was only the beginning of a battle between his heart and his duty. The man standing before him was more than an accused criminal. He was Daniel, his childhood friend. And what would happen in the coming days would test not just the justice system, but also the strength of Martin's character. The next day in court, the atmosphere felt even heavier than before. Everyone had heard whispers about the trial overnight, and the press outside was buzzing with headlines about the case. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, snapping photos and throwing questions, but inside, the trial carried on with the same seriousness. Judge Martin walked in, his robe flowing, his face calm. Yet inside, he was carrying a storm of emotions. He had barely slept the night before. All night, memories of Daniel haunted him, memories of laughter, shared secrets, and the dreams they once had as boys. Now those same memories stood in sharp contrast to the image of Daniel in handcuffs, facing the law. As the trial began again, the prosecution presented its opening statements. The lawyer painted a picture of Daniel as a man who had made poor choices for years, eventually leading him into crime. He described Daniel as reckless, irresponsible, and dangerous to society. The words cut into Martin's heart, even though he kept his expression unreadable. The man they described didn't sound like the boy he remembered. But then, life had changed Daniel. 30 years was a long time, and hardships could turn even the kindest soul into someone unrecognizable. Martin forced himself to stay focused on the words being said, reminding himself that his role was to guide the trial, not let his emotions interfere. When it was the defense attorney's turn, the story sounded very different. She spoke softly but firmly about Daniel's life, about the struggles he had faced since childhood. She reminded the jury that people are shaped by circumstances beyond their control. She talked about Daniel losing his father at a young age, his mother working day and night to provide for him, and the way he had to grow up faster than other kids. She explained how Daniel had dropped out of school to work odd jobs, trying to support his family but never earning enough. She admitted he had made mistakes, but she argued that those mistakes were born out of desperation, not evil. As the lawyer spoke, Martin's mind traveled back again to their youth. He remembered how Daniel would always share whatever little he had. Even if Daniel had only one cookie, he would break it in half and give Martin the bigger piece. That was the kind of friend he had been, kind, generous, and protective. Martin couldn't help but wonder, if life had been kinder to Daniel, would things have turned out differently? Would he be sitting in the jury box today as a respected man, rather than standing at the defense table as an accused criminal? The first witness was called to the stand. It was a neighbor who had seen Daniel on the night of the alleged robbery. The witness described seeing Daniel outside the store, acting suspicious. The prosecution nodded confidently as the jury listened. But when the defense cross-examined, the neighbor admitted that the area was dark and that he couldn't be completely certain it was Daniel. The tension in the room rose. The case was not as clear-cut as it first appeared. More witnesses came forward. Some spoke against Daniel, describing him as someone who had fallen in with the wrong crowd. Others said he was a man who had always tried to help people but often ended up in trouble because of it. Each word weighed on Martin's heart. He felt as if he was watching two different versions of his childhood friend being built right before his eyes. One was a man who had lost his way, and the other was still the boy who once dreamed of a better life. When Daniel himself was finally given a chance to speak, the courtroom fell silent. His voice was shaky at first, but then it grew steadier. He admitted that his life had been hard, that he had made mistakes he wasn't proud of. But he swore he wasn't the monster the prosecution described. He explained that on the night of the incident, he hadn't set out to commit a crime. He said he was trying to help a friend who had gotten into trouble, but things spiraled out of control. His words were filled with pain, but also with a kind of honesty that made some members of the jury lean forward, listening more closely. For a moment, Martin and Daniel's eyes met again. This time, Daniel didn't look away. His eyes were tired, but there was still something familiar in them, something that reminded Martin of the boy he once knew. In that brief moment, Martin saw not just the accused man before him, but also the child who used to dream beside him under the summer sky. It was a silent connection, but it said more than words ever could. The courtroom buzzed with whispers after Daniel spoke. Some people shook their heads, unconvinced. Others exchanged looks, clearly moved by his words. The prosecution quickly tried to discredit him, pointing out inconsistencies in his story. But no matter what they said, the image of Daniel standing there, vulnerable yet honest, stayed in Martin's mind. He wanted to believe him, but he also knew he couldn't let personal feelings interfere. Justice had to remain fair. During a short break, Martin retreated to his chambers again. He sat alone, staring at the wall, his mind racing. He remembered the last letter Daniel had written him when they were young. It had been a simple note, scribbled in messy handwriting, "One day we'll make it big, both of us. Don't forget me." Martin had kept it for years, tucked inside a book, until it was lost in one of his many moves. He wished he still had it now, proof of the promise they once made. He wondered if Daniel had ever remembered those words. Did he still believe in them? Or had life beaten that hope out of him long ago? When court resumed, the prosecution called another witness, a police officer who had arrested Daniel. The officer described how Daniel had resisted at first, but then surrendered quietly. The story made Daniel look guilty again, and the jury listened with stern faces. But Martin noticed something in the officer's tone, something that seemed uncertain. The defense caught it too and asked questions that revealed Daniel had not been violent or dangerous during the arrest, only scared. That small detail planted doubt in the minds of everyone present. The day dragged on, filled with testimony, evidence, and arguments. For the people in the audience, it was just another trial filled with drama. For Martin, it was a battle inside his own soul. Each story about Daniel pulled him in different directions between the boy he remembered and the man he saw now. He knew that soon, the jury would have to decide which version of Daniel they believed. And after that, Martin himself would have to pass judgment, a judgment that could either destroy his friend's life completely or give him a second chance. As the session ended for the day, the room slowly emptied. Families walked out, reporters rushed to send their stories, and lawyers whispered strategies. Martin remained seated for a moment longer, watching Daniel being led away in handcuffs. Daniel turned his head slightly, just enough to catch Martin's gaze one more time. This time, there was no recognition, no smile, only a quiet plea in his eyes, as if asking Martin to see beyond the mistakes and remember who he once was. When the doors closed and the courtroom fell silent again, Martin sat back and let out a long breath. He knew this trial was not just about law anymore. It was about the choices people make, the paths life forces them down, and the power of second chances. And deep inside, he wondered if he was ready for the hardest decision of his career, the decision that could shock not just the courtroom, but himself as well. The next morning, the courthouse was alive with murmurs. People talked about the trial as if it were a spectacle, yet for Judge Martin, it was anything but. He arrived early, walking through the tall wooden doors with a steady stride, but his mind felt heavier than ever. The previous day's testimonies replayed in his thoughts like a movie he could not pause. Every smile, every tear, every word from Daniel had left a mark on him. Martin knew that today, the trial would dig deeper into Daniel's past, and the court would have to examine truths that were uncomfortable, even painful. The day began with the defense presenting new evidence. They called a former teacher of Daniel's, Mrs. Harper, who had known him as a child. She described a bright, curious boy who had always tried to do the right thing. She remembered how Daniel had helped other students, even when he struggled with his own homework. Martin listened intently. Her words painted a picture of a young man who had potential, who had once dreamed of a better life. For a moment, it was as if the courtroom was filled with the smell of freshly sharpened pencils and the laughter of children playing outside, and Martin felt a pang of longing for simpler times. Mrs. Harper spoke about the challenges Daniel faced at home. She explained how he often came to school tired, hungry, and distracted because he had to care for his younger siblings while his mother worked long hours. Martin's heart tightened as he remembered Daniel's quiet resilience back then. He had never spoken much about his hardships, always smiling through his struggles, always finding time to lend a hand. Martin could see how life had shaped him, how circumstances that should have built character had instead forced him into situations that led to trouble. After the teacher finished, a social worker took the stand. She had spent months evaluating Daniel's life, his environment, and his character. She spoke about the influence of his friends, the neighborhoods he had grown up in, and the lack of opportunities he faced. She explained that people who grow up in difficult circumstances are more likely to make mistakes, but that didn't mean they were beyond redemption. Martin nodded slightly, knowing she was speaking the truth. The court needed to see the full story, not just the moment of the alleged crime. Then came a surprising twist. The defense brought in Daniel's childhood friend, Michael, who had grown up with him in the same neighborhood. Michael spoke of the dreams they shared, the games they played, and the promises they made. He said, "Daniel was always there for me, always looking out for others. He would give you the shirt off his back, and he never asked for anything in return." Martin felt a lump in his throat. The words reminded him of his own memories, the countless times Daniel had been there for him without expecting anything. It was as if a window had opened to the past, showing a brighter version of the man on trial. The prosecution tried to challenge Michael's words, asking if he could truly know who Daniel had become. Michael admitted that people change, but he insisted that the core of Daniel's character, the kindness, the loyalty, the honesty, was still there. Martin watched closely, noticing how the jury's faces softened slightly. Doubt began to creep into their minds, a doubt that wasn't there before. The trial was no longer just about the alleged crime. It was about the man behind the accusations, and slowly, his humanity was being revealed. When it was time for cross-examination, the prosecution asked Michael difficult questions. They asked why he hadn't reported Daniel's behavior in the past, why he hadn't intervened, why he still trusted him. Michael answered with calm sincerity. He explained that he had seen Daniel make mistakes, but he had also seen him try to correct them, to make things right. People aren't just their worst moments, he said. They are also the sum of their efforts to do better. His words echoed through the courtroom, leaving a quiet impression that lingered longer than any argument or evidence. Next, the defense shifted focus to Daniel himself. They presented letters and notes he had written over the years, letters of apology, notes of encouragement to friends and family, messages asking for guidance, and letters seeking forgiveness. Martin read them silently, amazed at the man's honesty and vulnerability. Each word seemed to reveal a person who had always tried to do right, even when life had made it nearly impossible. He could see the struggle in Daniel's writing, the desire to be better, the hope that someone would understand him. It was impossible not to feel a deep empathy for him. The prosecution then tried to counter these stories by emphasizing Daniel's alleged associations and poor choices. They presented testimonies from people who had once been his friends but had turned against him. They spoke of reckless decisions, moments of anger, and times when Daniel had acted carelessly. The room seemed heavier with each statement. Martin could see the jury grappling with the conflicting images, one of a caring, brave young man, and one of a person who had made serious mistakes. He felt the weight of the decision they would soon have to make. As the day wore on, Daniel's mother was called to testify. Her voice was trembling, but there was a strength behind it. She spoke about raising her children alone, about the sacrifices she had made, about the fear she felt when she realized her son was in trouble. She described the kind, sensitive boy Daniel had been, the one who cried when he saw injustice, who shared everything he had, who protected his siblings at all costs. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke, and Martin felt the room soften again. He could see the human cost of every choice Daniel had made, the burdens he had carried alone. After the mother left, Martin asked the jury to take a short recess. As the people filed out, he remained seated, lost in thought. He thought about the boy he had known, the man standing trial, and the society that had failed him. He realized that justice was not always simple, not always black and white. Life created shades of gray, and it was the role of a judge and a jury to navigate those shades with wisdom and fairness. He wondered how much of Daniel's current situation was the result of poor choices, and how much was the result of circumstances beyond his control. During the recess, Martin noticed Daniel standing quietly in the hallway, talking to his lawyer. He looked tired, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. Martin felt a strange mix of emotions: pity, admiration, sadness, and hope. He wanted to reach out, to tell Daniel that he remembered the boy he once was, that he still believed in his potential. But he could not. Not here, not now. The courtroom demanded professionalism, and personal feelings had no place in the official proceedings. Yet, the connection remained. It was unspoken, invisible, but undeniable. When the trial resumed, the defense presented a final witness, a local community leader who had worked with troubled youth for years. He spoke about the importance of guidance, support, and second chances. He explained that people could change, that they could grow beyond their mistakes if given the opportunity. He pointed to Daniel as an example of someone who had tried, who had faced hardships, but who still had the capacity to contribute positively to society. The jury listened intently, some nodding, some whispering quietly to one another. Martin could feel the tension in the room, the anticipation of the decision that was slowly approaching. By the end of the day, both sides had laid out their strongest arguments. Evidence, testimonies, and personal stories had painted a complex picture of Daniel, one that was difficult to summarize in simple terms. Martin knew the coming days would be critical. The jury would deliberate, and he would have to consider his own responsibility in guiding the process. He also knew that whatever the outcome, it would leave an impact not just on Daniel's life, but on the lives of everyone involved: the families, the community, and even himself. As the courtroom emptied, Martin stayed behind for a few quiet moments. He looked at the empty bench where he would soon give instructions to the jury. He thought about the boy who had once promised him that they would make it big, the young man who had always believed in fairness and honesty. He thought about the trials of life, the mistakes people make, and the possibility of redemption. In that moment, he realized that the story of Daniel was far from over. It was still being written, page by page, choice by choice, day by day. And he, as judge, had a role in determining how the next chapter would unfold. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. The city streets were alive with movement, oblivious to the quiet battles fought inside the courthouse walls. Martin walked to the window and watched the people pass by. He wondered how many had known hardship, how many had made mistakes, and how many had been given a second chance. He felt a deep responsibility to ensure that justice was tempered with understanding, that law and humanity could coexist. And somewhere deep inside, he hoped that the boy he remembered in Daniel would not be lost forever. The following morning, the courthouse was buzzing with energy. Word had spread quickly about the unusual nature of the trial, and reporters filled the hallways, cameras and microphones in hand. But inside the courtroom, Judge Martin tried to block out the noise. His focus remained on Daniel, who sat quietly with his lawyer, his hands folded, eyes forward, waiting for the day to unfold. Martin could still remember Daniel as a boy, full of hope and curiosity. Now, he was a young man shaped by life's challenges, facing his greatest test yet. The first witness of the day was a local business owner who had given Daniel a chance years ago when nobody else would. He described how Daniel had worked tirelessly, showing responsibility, honesty, and dedication. He made mistakes, the man admitted, but he also made an effort to correct them. Not many young people show that kind of commitment. Martin listened, feeling a mixture of pride and sadness. It was clear that Daniel had never stopped trying to be better, even when the world seemed determined to push him down. Next, the court heard from a neighbor who had observed Daniel during his teenage years. She spoke about his kind nature, the times he had helped elderly residents carry groceries, or taken care of neighborhood kids when their parents were busy. She remembered how he would mow lawns for free and help fix broken fences. He was always thinking of others before himself, she said. Martin's heart softened with every word. These were stories that painted Daniel as more than the crime he was accused of, they showed the essence of the person he truly was. The prosecution countered by presenting a series of emails and messages, intended to highlight Daniel's poor choices in recent years. They argued that the evidence showed a pattern of carelessness and impulsive behavior. Martin read through the documents carefully. Yes, there were mistakes, but they seemed to be moments of weakness rather than intentional harm. He thought about the pressures Daniel had faced: financial stress, family responsibilities, and the need to survive in a world that had not always been kind to him. Martin realized that judging him solely on these moments would be unfair. Then came the most intense part of the day. The defense brought Daniel to the stand. He was nervous, but as he began to speak, his confidence grew. He told his story with honesty, explaining the struggles he had faced growing up, the choices he had made, and the lessons he had learned. He admitted his mistakes without excuses and spoke about his efforts to make amends. Martin watched closely, seeing the sincerity in Daniel's eyes. This was a man taking responsibility for his life, not hiding behind blame or excuses. Daniel spoke about the support he had received from friends, teachers, and community members. He mentioned Michael, his childhood friend, and Mrs. Harper, his former teacher. He spoke about the letters he had written, the people he had tried to help, and the goals he had set for himself. Martin noticed that the jury was leaning forward, listening intently. Daniel's words had a quiet power. They were not dramatic or over the top, but filled with truth and humility. It was impossible not to feel empathy for him. The defense then asked Daniel about the day of the alleged incident. He explained calmly what had happened, step by step. He acknowledged his mistakes but also highlighted the misunderstandings that had led to the situation. Martin found himself nodding in quiet agreement. Daniel's explanation was clear, logical, and honest. He wasn't trying to manipulate anyone, he was simply telling the truth, as best as he could. It was a testimony that could not be ignored. After Daniel finished, the court took a short break. Martin remained seated, reflecting on everything he had heard. He thought about his own life, the choices he had made, and the people who had helped him along the way. He realized that life often presented challenges that seemed insurmountable, and it was not always easy to make the right decisions. He thought about Daniel, the boy he once knew, and the young man who now stood before him. The connection was undeniable, yet the role of the judge demanded impartiality. Still, Martin could not help but hope for a just and compassionate outcome. When the trial resumed, the defense presented a final witness, Daniel's younger sister. She was emotional but composed. She spoke about how much Daniel had sacrificed for their family, how he had protected them, and how he had always tried to provide love and support. Her words were heartfelt, filled with admiration and gratitude. She described how Daniel had been a role model for her, teaching her values of kindness, resilience, and honesty. Martin felt a lump in his throat. The courtroom was silent, everyone absorbing the weight of her testimony. It was clear that Daniel had made a significant positive impact on those closest to him. The prosecution tried one last time to challenge the picture the defense had painted. They called a former acquaintance of Daniel's who claimed he had witnessed some troubling behavior. However, the testimony lacked consistency and credibility. Martin noticed the jury exchanging uncertain glances. The contrast between the two sides was becoming more apparent. On one side, there was a man who had made mistakes but had shown growth, responsibility, and a desire to help others. On the other side, there were isolated incidents that, while concerning, did not define the whole person. Martin could feel the tension building as the trial approached its conclusion. As the day ended, Judge Martin prepared to give instructions to the jury. He reminded them that their role was to consider all evidence, all testimonies, and the full context of Daniel's life. He emphasized the importance of fairness, empathy, and the recognition that people are more than their worst moments. Martin's voice was steady, but inside, he felt a deep emotional connection to the case. He thought about the boy he had once played with, the young man trying to find his place in the world, and the community that had both challenged and supported him. He hoped the jury would see the truth that had been presented. After the instructions, the jury began deliberations. Martin remained in his chambers, reflecting on the journey so far. He thought about the lessons he had learned from Daniel, from his family, and from the people who had testified. He realized that justice was not just about punishment, it was about understanding, about recognizing human complexity, and about offering opportunities for growth and redemption. He knew that whatever decision was reached, it would carry weight far beyond the courtroom walls. Lives would be affected, futures shaped, and communities influenced. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm. People walked, cars honked, and the sun began to dip behind the buildings. Martin looked out the window, thinking about the paths people take in life, the choices they make, and the support they receive along the way. He felt a sense of responsibility and hope. He hoped that the system could recognize not just the mistakes but also the efforts to be better. He hoped that Daniel's story would not end in despair but could instead mark a turning point toward a brighter future. By the evening, the jury had reached a decision. Martin called everyone back into the courtroom. The room was tense, filled with anticipation. Daniel sat quietly, hands clasped, his eyes focused but calm. Martin felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. He looked at the jurors as they filed in, each carrying the weight of their decision. The air was thick with expectation. Everyone in the courtroom waited, holding their breath, knowing that the next words would change lives forever. The foreperson of the jury stood and began to speak. "We, the jury, have reached a verdict," she said, her voice steady but soft. The courtroom leaned in, silent. Martin's heart raced, memories of the past mingling with the gravity of the present. The foreperson continued, "We find the defendant," and paused, letting the words sink in. Martin could feel every eye on him, waiting for him to hear, waiting for justice to be served. The tension was palpable, and the moment seemed suspended in time. The courtroom was completely silent. Every eye was fixed on the jury foreperson as she prepared to deliver the verdict. Daniel sat stiffly in his chair, hands tightly clasped, but his eyes betrayed a quiet hope. Judge Martin could feel the tension in the room. He knew that this moment was not only a turning point in the trial, but also in Daniel's life. The foreperson cleared her throat, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. "We, the jury, have reached a verdict," she said, her voice firm but calm. Daniel's heart pounded. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Martin's hand rested lightly on the bench, ready to respond to whatever the jury had decided. The foreperson continued, "On the charges before us, we find the defendant." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, each syllable stretching longer than it should. The tension was almost unbearable. "Not guilty." The words echoed through the courtroom. A collective gasp arose, followed by whispers and the shuffling of feet. Daniel felt his body relax for the first time in months. Relief flooded him, and tears prickled his eyes. He had feared this day for so long, and now, the weight of uncertainty had been lifted. He looked toward Judge Martin, who nodded slightly, a small but meaningful gesture of recognition. It was as though Martin was silently telling him, "You have fought through, and you are free to move forward." Daniel's lawyer rose, a wide smile spreading across his face. "Justice has been served," he said quietly, as Daniel's family rushed forward to embrace him. His younger sister clung to him first, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I knew you could do it," she whispered. Daniel hugged her tightly, feeling the warmth of family support wrap around him. His parents followed, their faces a mixture of relief and pride. They had endured many sleepless nights, worried for their son, and now they could breathe again. Judge Martin called the court to order. "The verdict has been delivered," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "The defendant is free to go." Daniel stood slowly, his legs a little unsteady, but he managed to keep his composure. As he walked out of the courtroom, the crowd parted to let him pass. Some people clapped softly, while others simply watched, their expressions filled with quiet admiration. It was a rare moment in the city's courthouse, a story of redemption, honesty, and hope. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly. The streets were busy, but Daniel barely noticed. He walked with his family, feeling a sense of freedom he had not felt in years. People approached to shake his hand or offer congratulations, and Daniel smiled warmly at each person. He realized that even in the face of hardship, kindness existed in the world. He remembered the witnesses who had spoken on his behalf, the neighbors, teachers, and community members who had seen his efforts to be better. Their belief in him had made this moment possible. Later that evening, Daniel returned to his apartment with his family. They sat together, sharing stories, laughter, and relief. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt at peace. He thought about the lessons he had learned during the trial, the importance of honesty, resilience, and community. He realized that mistakes were a part of life, but so was the opportunity to grow, to change, and to be understood. He knew that this was not just an ending, but also a new beginning. Judge Martin, meanwhile, returned to his chambers. He sat at his desk, thinking about the trial and the impact it had on everyone involved. He reflected on the power of the judicial system not just to punish, but to recognize truth and humanity. Seeing Daniel stand strong, even in the face of adversity, reminded him of his own youth and the people who had shaped his life. He felt a deep satisfaction knowing that justice had been served in a fair and compassionate way. The next day, the local news stations covered the story. Headlines praised the jury's careful deliberation and the integrity of the court. Daniel's story became an example of resilience and hope, inspiring others who faced challenges in their own lives. People wrote letters, called to offer encouragement, and shared their own stories of personal growth. Daniel realized that his experience could help others, and he felt a sense of responsibility to use his freedom wisely. In the weeks that followed, Daniel focused on rebuilding his life. He returned to work, determined to prove himself through action rather than words. He volunteered in his community, helping young people who struggled like he had. He met with neighbors, teachers, and local leaders, sharing his story and encouraging others to persevere. Slowly but surely, he began to feel a sense of purpose that went beyond his personal struggles. Every small act of kindness, every moment of honesty, reminded him that life could be meaningful and fulfilling. One afternoon, Daniel received a letter from Judge Martin. Inside, he found a note that read, "I am proud of the person you have become. Never forget the value of truth, responsibility, and compassion. The choices you make now will define your future. Keep moving forward." Daniel held the letter close to his heart. It was more than just words, it was a reminder that someone he respected had seen his efforts, recognized his growth, and believed in him. It motivated him to continue striving to be the best version of himself. Over time, Daniel's story spread further. Schools invited him to speak to students about resilience and honesty. Community groups asked him to share his experience, teaching others the importance of standing up for oneself and learning from mistakes. Daniel embraced these opportunities, using his journey as a source of inspiration. He understood that his past did not define him, rather, it was his response to challenges and his commitment to growth that truly mattered. Through it all, Judge Martin continued his work on the bench, occasionally thinking back to Daniel's trial. He knew that life was full of complicated choices, but he also understood that people were capable of incredible change. He felt gratitude for having been part of Daniel's story, witnessing firsthand the power of integrity, courage, and support. It was a reminder that the legal system, at its best, could uplift, guide, and allow people to reclaim their lives. Years later, Daniel looked back on that trial as the turning point of his life. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and judgment, yet he emerged stronger and wiser. He had learned to value truth, humility, and perseverance. More importantly, he had discovered the strength that comes from the support of others, the teachers, neighbors, and friends who believed in him, even when the world doubted. Daniel knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but he felt ready to face them, armed with the lessons he had learned in the courtroom. As the sun set on another day, Daniel walked through his neighborhood, greeting familiar faces, sharing smiles, and feeling a deep connection to the world around him. He knew that the past could not be changed, but the future was in his hands. With courage, honesty, and kindness as his guides, Daniel was determined to make the most of every opportunity, proving not just to the world but to himself that growth, redemption, and hope were always possible. In the end, the trial was more than a legal proceeding, it was a story about life, learning, and the human spirit. It showed that even when circumstances seem overwhelming, determination, integrity, and support can lead to transformation. Daniel's journey reminded everyone that people are not defined by their mistakes, but by their willingness to learn, change, and move forward. And as he continued to build his life, Daniel carried with him a quiet strength, a renewed purpose, and the knowledge that he had been given a second chance to create a meaningful future.